Hello, listeners, and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker, Casey, and it is the first Friday of the month, which means that we have a new memoir to feature on the show. Today, I am speaking with author and activist Erika Bornman, who has written a memoir titled Mission of Malice, My Exodus from KwaSizabantu. I have absolutely loved the chance to get to know Erika, and I am incredibly moved by her work highlighting this movement and working with fellow survivors. This month's hashtag monthly memoir giveaway, here is my newest patron and friend, Erika Bornman. So hello, Erika, and thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today. I have had the absolute honour of reading your memoir, Mission of Malice, My Exodus from KwaSizabantu. And what an incredible book it was as well. We have heard about this group on the show previously, thanks to Daniel, but I am so eager to bring your experiences and perspective to the listeners. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Yeah, so hi, Casey. Oh, and how chuffed I am to be on your podcast. I'm a huge fan. I love the way you interview people. I love the knowledge and the empathy and the just understanding you bring to everybody's story. So I'm super excited to be here with you today.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Erika.
So I'm Erika Bornman. I'm South African. I was born in Malawi because my dad was a missionary teacher in Malawi, which is a tiny little country north of South Africa. But most of my life I've lived in South Africa, and my parents got involved in a place called KwaSizabantu, and that is Zulu for the place where people are helped. And I'll let your listeners decide what they think about that.
But for anyone who didn't tune into the previous episode that we did with Daniel, or for anybody who hasn't heard of this particular religious group before, could you give us a brief history and summary of KSB?
Yeah, so KwaSizabantu, we shorten it to KSB, and sometimes a lot of us also refer to it as the mission. So I'll probably use those three terms interchangeably in this podcast. It's a mission station in KwaZulu-Natal on the South African East Coast that was founded in the early 1970s by a South African German by the name of Stegen, quite an imposing man. He was like an evangelist that went around to Zulu villages and that, and he supposedly had a revival, like God came down in a great wind. I think they were in stables or a cow shed or something. And miracles started to happen. Like people who were blind could suddenly see, people who couldn't walk could suddenly walk, and wada. Anyway, then a few years later, his brother, he was one of 6 children, his brother bought a farm that he then gave to Elo to it was on the border. So at the time, this is apartheid South Africa. So at the time, we had white South Africa, and then we had the kind of the black areas where black people were allowed to live, which was Zululand at the time. And so this place, KwaSizabantu, was on the border between the white province, Natal, and Zululand. So it also became a place where people of different races could meet, which was very unusual in apartheid times. They are an industrious lot. They started farming, and they have a dairy. They have a teachers training college. They have a school. They actually ended up having satellite missions in many countries in Europe, in America, in Romania, in Hungary, in Russia, I think, Australia. So they kind of spread their message across the globe. And their two biggest money makers are the avocados that they export to the UK and Europe and the EU, and Aquele, which is the water company. I think it's the largest water bottling company in South Africa, and they make millions from that. So they are actually kind of a very business-focused cult. But I call them a cult. I think they're a cult. And we'll figure out why I say that as we go on.
And this particular movement you mentioned at the start, it's not something you were born into, but something your parents became involved in when you were quite young.
Yeah, I was around 8 years old, I think, when my mother first went to listen to one of them preach. And then shortly thereafter, we moved across the country and we were closer to them and we started going there for Sunday services.
In your book, Mission of Malice, there is
Mhm.
quite a strong section that focuses on your first kind of interactions with your mum when she comes home with these new kind of ideas or new adopted belief systems and this really kind of strange changing character. I wondered if you could just kind of talk the listeners through that experience as you remember it.
Yeah, so at that time, I mean, our society and our communities were fairly safe. So we used to walk to school. And I remember coming home the one day and my mother had made a huge bonfire in the backyard. It was a huge backyard that we had. I think our house was on a half-acre plot and my dad farmed vegetables and fruit in the back. But she'd made a big fire and she was burning her clothes and her shoes and her makeup, jewelry. Like she was basically just burning just about everything she had, in terms of personal belongings. And I remember her burning my and my sister's trousers and shorts as well. And in the pocket of one of these trousers, she found a little note that a boy in my class that I liked and that he liked me had written me. And I actually think he gave me, there was a necklace in there as well. I seem to remember there was a necklace as well where he expressed how much he liked me. And my mum was very upset when she saw this. And so she burnt all our clothes and she said to me that she burned all those things because they didn't honor God. And that from now on, we would only wear clothing that honored God. And that was no more trousers, no more shorts, only dresses and skirts below the knee, so a very modest way of dressing and no jewelry except for a watch. And if you're married, your wedding or engagement ring as a woman, and no makeup whatsoever. Yeah.
So would you say that this was quite out of character and strange for your mum, or was this in keeping with her personality?
Well, she was always so well put together and she took such pride in how she looked, and she used to make my sister and I clothes and we were always so well dressed. So I think that it was a change in that suddenly her appearance was no longer so important. But I think she always tended to do things a little bit to the extreme. But I was a little girl, so I didn't really know any better, Yeah.
And growing up, you had siblings as well. Were they present for this experience?
Well, my brother doesn't remember it, and my sister claims that the fire happened at night. And that's my mother's story, is that I didn't witness it. She didn't burn my clothes and it happened at night. That's not how I remember it.
And how long was it before you made that move that you mentioned before, after this experience of your mum coming home, kind of purging some of the family items? And was there like a slow funneling into more engagement with KSB, or was it kind of a fast sweep into life in KwaZizabantu?
So for a little girl, for me, it felt like a really fast sweep. So we moved across the country, and then my mother went and stayed there for about 3 months. It might have been longer, but for a long period of time. And then in the next year, my parents sold up everything, and they then decided to leave us children at KwaSizabantu to go to school at a school 50 kilometers away. Gosh, I don't know how many miles that is. Probably, oh my word. Yeah, anyway, I only think in terms of kilometers and the metric system. And they went to France to learn French because my dad wanted to be a missionary to French-speaking Africa. But they thought they were leaving us in good hands. And I turned 10 when I was there. So I was 9 years old when they left us there. I think my mom was away for about 9 months and my dad for just over a year.
31 miles, I think, is what Google is telling me is how far that is. So that's a good hour's drive, I think.
So we'd get into this old bus, and it was like quite a narrow road, and in that part of KwaZulu-Natal there's a lot of mist. So I just remember like barreling down these very windy roads, and we'd have to sing all these KwaSizabantu songs. And the only time we didn't sing was when the high school children were writing exams, and then I could actually just read my books in peace. Yeah.
There was a part in your book that was quite telling about or almost foreshadowing about the types of high demands that would be placed on children in KSB because of the pressure to sing on the bus and the ramifications if you didn't. So I don't know if you could just kind of explain that impossible cycle for the listeners.
Yes. So if someone started singing on the bus, we would all have to join in, because if we didn't join in, then that kind of meant that our lives weren't right with God. And if our lives weren't right with God, then there was some punishment that was needed. And so by singing, you kind of didn't bring any attention to yourself that you might be a potential problem, even if you didn't want to sing, even if you didn't like singing, even if you really just wanted to read or study or do nothing, you forced yourself to sing, because not doing so would mean that you were not your path with God, your walk with God wasn't right. Your life wasn't right with God.
And this is not something that starts happening straight away. This is kind of after you've become slowly more involved in KSB. And then you mentioned that your parents were called to missionary work where they traveled out of the country. And so you were left to live on the commune?
Yes.
Was that typical for other children kind of similar to your age group?
So no, my age group, no, definitely not. The older children, there were some parents in Johannesburg who felt that they wanted to take their children out of the normal schooling. Although the school we went to was still a government school, where we were living was KwaSizabantu, they just felt they wanted to put their children into a more godly arena. So I don't know. I think there must have been about 30 of us, but I and my brother were definitely the youngest. Like the girls in my dormitory were all much older than me. They were in high school, which in South Africa starts in your 8th year of school. You go to high school, and I was only in my 5th year of school. So I was much younger than them. And I remember that I was 9-10 years old and I started wetting my bed, and just the shame attached to that, because these are all older girls. And my sister, but it's not my sister's fault, she wasn't supposed to be mothering me. But I just remember feeling so alone. And when I try and think of that time, there's certain memories that pop up, but mostly it's just when I think of that time, it's just a cold, dark corridor, because the dormitory was kind of in the middle of a big building, and I had to walk down a corridor to get to the communal bathrooms and toilets. And because I was wetting my bed, I tried to always go to the toilet so that I wouldn't wet my bed. Of course, I understand now that really I could have pretty much emptied my bladder and I would probably still have wet my bed, you know. But I remember the one night I was walking in this dark corridor and there was a frog in my way. And I remember being absolutely struck by fear because I didn't know whether this frog was going to jump on me, because they're unpredictable. You know, you don't know which way they're going to jump, and they can jump. And I remember that this frog just became this huge monster in my mind's eye. And to this day, I cannot handle seeing a frog. I have this, like, give me a snake rather than a frog, you know, like I have this absolute fear of frogs, which is completely irrational, but you're not rational when you're a little girl, you know, in a dark corridor. Yeah.
That part of the book it's great how you have created a chronology of your experiences. So that part of the book is quite early on in comparison to the rest of your experiences, but you do reference the frog later on, saying that there's still things that you are scared of, and frogs are one of those things. But I suppose in your mind, perhaps it's such an imposing thing because it's attached to all of those negative feelings and experiences that you were having at that time. And I really wondered at that moment how many other children there are that went through similar experiences because of parental neglect through missionary work, whether that's the Unification Church or whether that's, you know, parents that went to follow Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, as we've had Roni talk about on the show before. So there's so many different things that spring to mind when you were going through that experience. And I just wanted to pick you up and give you a cuddle because it just sounded like there was no comfort or warmth there. And rightly so, your sister doesn't want to be subjected to parentification, which is another huge part of high demand religious groups. And there was also a segregation from you and your brother as well because of the no mixing of genders.
Yeah, boys and girls didn't talk. And so my brother and I probably didn't exchange many words at all in that year, you know, because it was so frowned upon. And we were so scared to put a foot wrong, because when you put a foot wrong, you were called into a meeting and you were given a severe beating in front of the other children. So that's how they kind of kept us in line, you know, and they showed us these horrific movies. It's I want to call him an arsehole, but it's a US, it's an American evangelist, Eustace Perkel, who made these horrible movies called The Burning Hell and The Believer's Heaven. And The Burning Hell, you know, I watched a little snippet of it on YouTube the other day, just to see if it was as bad as I remember. And I mean, the what do you call them? The effects, the special effects that they use is so laughable, because of course this movie comes from the 1970s and not from Hollywood even. So it's stupid. You can see the people aren't burning, and you can see the maggots crawling on them aren't coming out of their eyes. But as a young child, and we didn't have a TV when I grew up, and there were no TVs allowed at KwaSizabantu. So I wasn't familiar with the idea that a movie is a depiction of someone's thought of what it might be like. For me, this was reality. And they kept saying to us that this is what was waiting for us. And the scary thing is that toddlers were made to watch this movie. So the age restriction, they had no age restriction. There was one movie which was specifically utterly horrific. It was called, we just called it The Footman for short. But it depicted what communists do when they take over, you know, because we were taught that communists were terrible, and after premarital sex, communists were the biggest evil. And in the one scene, and I should say this whole chat is probably trigger warning alert, but the soldiers put a bamboo stake through a boy's in his one ear and out his other ear, and then they talk about what communists do to Christian women and how they rip them apart and like really horrific. So they instilled so much fear into us. No wonder I wet my bed, by firstly beating children in public in front of us. My one friend, I recall this in the book, I call her Jessie. She was around 8 years old and she took some toffees that didn't belong to her, and another child saw her and snitched on her, which they encouraged snitching. And we were all called into the upper room and made to sit down, and this woman, Jenny, she said, look, a beating isn't good enough. And she whispered to David Jata, and he returned with a big butcher's knife. And Jenny said, in the Bible, the Bible is very clear that thieves get their hands cut off, And she said to Jessie, so is it going to be the beating or the knife? They used an orangey red plumbing pipe that they beat us with. And sometimes they'd fill it with sand to make it heavier, And she obviously, they didn't cut off her hand. But the scary thing for me, looking back at this, is that I didn't doubt that it was God's will. Whatever they did to Jessie would have been God's will, because they had the way, God spoke to them. Everything they did was ordained by God. So whatever happened to me was ordained by God,
That's terrifying. That's so terrifying to think that your mind, the small vulnerable mind of a child, is so quickly thrown into that thought reform that you could go from living in one part of South Africa with your parents to them leaving you in this place where how quickly did that happen? You're like, I believe that this is God's will, and I don't see how this is not going to happen. And if she has her hands taken off, then that's what should be, that is what should happen. And I think that is so wild to think how quickly that you went from just being a carefree child to just being somebody that was like, okay, well, she's going to have her hands cut off.
Yeah. And that it would be horrific, but it would be okay. And we those of us who were watching, we weren't allowed to cry or show any emotion, because that meant that we were associating ourselves with a sinner. And how they got you to snitch was that if you knew of, we haven't even dealt with the confession thing yet. We haven't even gotten there yet. But so shall I tell you a bit about
Erika,
that?
You just continue as you are. Your stream of consciousness is great.
So KwaSizabantu, someone had a revelation or something, that to get rid of all your sin and to have God forgive you, you have to confess it to one of the leaders of KwaSizabantu. And this, you wouldn't see heaven unless you confessed all your sin. So every week you had to see your counselor. They called them counselors. And it's so wrong, because they were not trained. These are just like random adults who had risen high enough in the ranks that they were now given this authority to have people come and confess their sins to them. And everything is a sin, like anger, irritation, thinking a boy is cute, like everything is a sin, and you have to confess it. And if you go to bed, and they kept telling us that God could come take us at any time, and if you died, if he came to take you in the middle of the night and you had one unconfessed sin in your life, you would go to hell. So I mean, like later on, I can't reconcile that with what the mainstream Christian church believes, which is that God's salvation is there. These guys, you never knew where you stood with God. You were always on edge, because anything could be a sin, and someone could see you do something. And so how they got us to snitch on each other was that if I saw my friend, or I knew of a friend's sin and I didn't confess it, I was as guilty as her, and I would go to hell. So, you couldn't have deep friendships because you couldn't confide anything, because you and your friend might laugh at that idiot man who was saying stupid things or being pretentious. But then next week, God might speak to her and she might realize that that was a sin, and she confesses it and I didn't confess it. So it was always a race, like who was going to confess first? Because if you were the first to confess, your punishment was a little bit lighter. Yeah, it's just like, in my book, I equal it to living in a concentration camps,
Absolutely.
and I don't want to minimize what the concentration camps were like, but that's the only way I can kind of describe how it felt, was that every day. And that Bible verse that talks about how God sees every hair, he counts every thread of hair or every piece of hair on your head.
I'm not that familiar with the Bible,
Yeah,
Erica.
but
I am trying, but it's one of my downfalls.
No, there's a Bible verse. And so English is my second language. And sometimes, especially when I get a bit emotional, I lose like a strand of hair. I couldn't remember whether it was a thread or a strand. But anyway, God knows and counts every hair on your head. Now, I suppose for many people that might be comforting, but for me, it was absolutely terrifying. So God was present every single moment of the day, and he was judging me every single moment of the day. The God that they taught me was a masculine monarch who was out for vengeance. There was nothing about love there. Yeah.
So the self-policing that is encouraged within KwaZizabantu is only backed up by the spiritual rhetoric that is being used within the group.
Yes.
And so much of what you said in that last segment is like, I've been scribbling notes as we go. So many of those techniques that you've explored, we have covered so meticulously when we talk about the troubled teen industry. It's the parallels are shocking, and I think you use the words concentration camp, but I don't think that's the first time that these captive situations have been explained in that way, in terms of children that have been left by their parents to exist in these environments where, as you said, the people in positions of power, they move the goalposts. It's impossible. It's designed for failure so that you get punished either way. And that's why you said it. There's no identifiable rights and wrongs, because it's designed for you to be punished in that way. So even if your experience ended here with the neglect and the systemic beatings and the breakdown of sibling relationships between you and your sister and your brother, that in itself is more than enough for you to want to write a book and expose this movement for the heinous abuse of children. And this is literally just the first few chapters that we're talking about here.
Yes.
And the fact that you said that, there are counselors, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that kind of segment of the book as well. They have these air quotes counselors, but kind of reject actual modern medicine in both the kind of physical and psychological side of modern medicine. That to me was ironic. And then also the fact that they apply all of these pleasant sounding phrases to actually controlling the congregants and the members of KSB. I was just reading it and I was thinking, nobody stands a chance in this environment, no matter what position you're in or what place in the hierarchy you fall. Absolutely nobody stands a chance in this environment. So, even if your experience in KSB ended at age 12, that's enough for a lifetime of trauma, of deconstructing, of unpacking this abuse that you experienced. And of course, that's not where your journey ends. And it's not where a lot of other children that you were with at that time's journeys end either. You mentioned that there were around 30 other children with you at that time, give or take. How long was it before your parents returned again? You mentioned your mum was gone for 9 months.
Yes. And then my dad for about a year. And then when they came back, we actually moved to Johannesburg. and my father worked for Open Doors Mission, which isn't associated with KwaSizabantu Mission at all. At the time, many of South Africa's neighbors were, okay, so now I'm remembering this as a young child, but were communist countries, Angola, Mozambique, Madagascar, and they didn't look favorably upon Christians. And so my father would go into these countries to take Bibles to these Christians and speak to them and just tell them the world hasn't forgotten about you, kind of thing. He put his life on the line very often, but he wasn't associated with KwaSizabantu at all in that time. So those 3 years in Johannesburg were a break, even though I was a complete misfit at school because I didn't know what Dallas was, and I didn't know, all these things that, and yeah, but there was a respite. We would go to someone's home for the services, and over school holidays, we would often go back to KwaSizabantu, but we were in a stable family home still. And then when I turned 15, my father came to us and said that, look, KwaSizabantu was starting a school. Now, at that time, this was at the end of 1986, still in apartheid days, but apparently the South African Department of Education had decided to bring sex education into schools. And KwaSizabantu was like, you are not going to teach my child about sex. So they were starting the school so that they could control what they taught the children. And because my dad was a teacher, they asked him if he would be principal of this new school they were starting. So he told us we'd be moving back. My sister was about to start her first year of studying metallurgical engineering. And my brother was about to start his final year of school. And he'd been made a prefect. And so my sister stayed and my brother stayed behind and stayed with family and friends. And I was the only one who moved back to KwaSizabantu with my parents. But I thought that this time it would be okay because my dad would be there to protect me.
So at this point, it might be worth kind of exploring with you. And so the listeners kind of get an idea of what your relationship was like with your mother and father at this point, and what your relationship with education in public school was like as well before this big transition and change happened for you at that moment in your life.
So I was one of those children whose kind of personality and intellect suited school. I was always top of my class and a little bit of a teacher's pet because I was so we read a lot. I was 3 years old when my dad taught me to read because I was so grumpy that my older brother and sister could read and I couldn't read. So my dad had to teach me to read because I was sulking so much. So we were a family of readers, and because we didn't have television, that's what we did. We read voraciously. We still are. All of us are voracious readers. So I really enjoyed school and I excelled at school. My father, when I would bring back my report, would say to me, "Is this the best you could do, Erika?" Like he wanted me to compete against myself, not against other children. So if I was top of my class, it was good, but had I done my absolute best? Whereas my mother's response was, don't get a big head. This isn't you. This is God working through you. Like, don't think you're anything special. So on the one hand, I had my dad telling me that I was wonderful. And then I had my mother telling me that I was nothing special. And in my it was standard 5. So my 7th year of school, one of my teachers, Mr. Lowe, he came to see my parents, but my dad was on one of his mission trips. I don't know if it was in Angola or Mozambique. And when he went, we would never hear from him until he came back. And so he spoke to my mother and he said to her that there was this school for highly gifted children that were prepared to offer me a scholarship. And because he had contacted them on my behalf, and my mother just said to him, no, Erika's nothing special. she's not going to go there, because he noticed that I was really bored at school. And then after he left, she said to me, don't get a big head about this. You really aren't intelligent or special. You know, this is all God working through you. So, yeah, so I excelled at school. I loved being at school. I always had really good relationships with my teachers. And then, and I had a really good relationship with my father. But I had a somewhat lesser good relationship with my mother. Because she was very, like, when she called me in, she would call me into their room and we'd sit down and then she'd pray, and then I would know that I'm in trouble. And so after she prays, then she tells me what I did wrong, and then I would get a hiding. My dad also gave us hidings, but they weren't the kind of beatings that I witnessed at KwaSizabantu. Yeah, my mother, gosh, you know, my sister now says that my mother gave me sex education when I turned 10, because she says that's what happened to her. But when my sister turned 10, we weren't part of KwaSizabantu yet. And when I turned 10, we were. What happened was, I was around 12 or 13 years old when I noticed, can I talk about these things on your podcast?
Absolutely. I think this is incredibly important. Yeah. And I really want to highlight all of these points, because so many people have had these experiences where they've been kind of in the same boat of you, with just just so much information missing.
So I was around 12 or 13 when I noticed that I had some blood in my panties, and I thought, oh my God, I've got stomach cancer. I'm going to die. And this is because I'm such a sinner. I'm going to die. This is God's punishment. And so I just would wash my panties by hand. And then one day my mother saw me washing my panties by hand, and she called me and she prayed with me. And I was like, oh, I'm in trouble. And then she said to me, okay, you're a woman now. This is blood. This is going to happen every month. Here are sanitary pads. You put them in your panties, and here's how you dispose of them afterwards. And now really stay away from boys. And then she prayed again with me. And that was the extent of the education I got about what was happening with me, with my body, anything. So I didn't, I mean, we'll get to that when I'm kind of 19 and that horrific experience. But I had no understanding of my anatomy, and that it wasn't my stomach that was bleeding. Just, it's just, you know, when you're so ignorant, you don't know anything. And we'll talk about how that just leaves you open to abuse as well.
And another part that was interesting about one of those points where your mum called you into the room and just asked you if you'd been touching yourself below, and you were like, why would I, what do you mean play with myself, what do you mean? And she's like, have you been doing that? And you were like, no. And she's like, great, well, let's keep it that way. And that's the end of that conversation. And you're just left like with more questions
than ever, because I'm not supposed to touch myself down there. So why would I be playing with myself down there? You know, like, I knew that part of me was dirty and evil, and I wasn't supposed to touch it. You know, this isn't something I wrote in my book, but oh my God, yeah, there was we were at the mission, and there was this family, and I was friends with the one daughter, and I was staying over there, and we bathed together. And I remember looking at her naked and realizing that she didn't have the brown spots near her vagina that I have. And then I realized with absolute shame that was dirt. It was because I was so scared of touching myself, that I actually had a buildup of dirt on my skin there. And the shame, I can't describe to you the shame I felt at that realization, and that now she saw me naked, so she must think I'm like such a dirty person. And yeah, so I was so scared of touching myself down there that I didn't even wash myself down there, you know. Yeah, it's just insane. Oh God.
That's just so heartbreaking. And how many people are going through these experiences because of the lack of sex and relationship education in high demand religious groups, where pages about anatomy are ripped out of textbooks, and any mention of the birds and bees is it just explained as, you know, a man and a wife get married.
That's it.
And that's as far as it goes. And when you were enrolled into KSB's brand new school, did things stay the same for you? Did you stay on track with your education? Were you taking the same sorts of classes? How did that look?
So what happened is the day before, 2 days before school opened, apparently there was a school board meeting, and my father was part of the meeting. And when he came out of that meeting, he phoned his sister, who wasn't part of the mission. And he said to her, "What have I done? I've brought my family to this dark place." And apparently in that meeting, my dad didn't agree with a lot of what they said. And so they said to him, "Okay, you're not going to be principal anymore. You're allowed to stay on as teacher, but you're not going to be dictating school policy or anything." And then the next morning, he was 43 years old. He had a heart attack and died. And so I was 15 years old, and my big protector died. And then it was supposed to be a multiracial school, but I don't think they had prepared properly. So us white kids had to do we had to do studies via correspondence. And this was tricky for me, especially because my schooling up until then had been in Afrikaans. And now suddenly, and I could speak English, but now suddenly all my schooling was in English. Nobody checked up on me. I went for months without reading anything, without studying. And when we finally wrote exams, mathematics, which when I was in general school, in government schools, was my best subject. And I went from getting 97% for mathematics to getting 17%. And of course, I internalized that shame. It was my shame. I didn't see it as them failing to provide me with an adequate education. I saw it as me failing my dad, you know. So then our final year of school, I think they realized that us three white children who had all been high performing weren't going to do very well. And so they suddenly found us teachers for most of our subjects. And so I got a pass, and I got university exemption, but I should have had all A's, and I think I only had one A in one subject. So no, my schooling was definitely below par. Yeah, and they have this great track record, Domino Savite School, of having 100% pass rate for matrics, which is our final year of school. But what they don't tell anybody, and certainly it happened in the years that I was there, is that they wouldn't actually allow a child to go into matric if they didn't think they would pass, or they would dictate to them that they had to take it in a lower grade or whatever. So they very carefully manipulated their 100% pass rate, which they are so, boastful about. But yeah. Sorry, I keep going off on tangents.
No, I love it. I'm just making notes as we go. So please don't apologize and just carry on as you are, because this is amazing. You mentioned that your father lost the position that he was originally offered for standing up against some of the school policies. And I wonder if you ever found out what those specific policies were that he was not happy with.
No, he didn't elaborate. And my aunt only told me this to me many years later. He didn't elaborate, but I imagine it would have been around the punishment, because I checked with my brother, and neither him nor I ever told my dad what happened to us in that year that he left us at KwaSizabantu. And I know I didn't want to tell him because I knew that he would blame himself, and I didn't want him to be hurt by what they had done to us. And for my brother, it was the same. And funnily enough, the day he died, I felt that I was responsible in some way because I hadn't told him the truth, of what had happened. Yeah, I blamed myself for my father's death for a very long time.
I wonder if it was eye-opening for him to sit down with the other staff of the school and maybe put some pieces together about what had been happening to you and your brother and sister during that time when he wasn't there.
I think it must have, because I remember when he was in France, he would sometimes phone. And I remember him once saying to me, Erika, you aren't writing to me anymore. You aren't writing to us. What's going on? Why are we not hearing from you? And I couldn't. And to this day, when I'm struggling, I don't talk. I don't reach out to people. I just struggle on my own. And then when I'm feeling better, I'll tell someone, okay, I was going through a hard time. But I couldn't tell my dad what was going on because I knew it would hurt him, and I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to protect him. But he knew that something was wrong. He just didn't know what it was but he knew something was wrong because I just stopped writing to them. Yeah.
Sometimes during these discussions, it's so and through reading your work as well with you as the narrator and your experiences kind of there on the paper, it's really easy to kind of get that tunnel vision of just your experiences being the main focus of the book. But of course, there is all of the other things to consider around your parents' experience around thought reform and the realization that all of these things may have been happening to his own children. Yes. And so the questions are so much more than just, how could parents leave? Yes. Because the pressure for them to carry out this missionary work was probably much more significant than any of us could ever understand. Yeah. And so there's so much more to consider when we think about these people's experiences. And it's really heartbreaking as well for me to hear you in your book kind of negate all of the things that and praise that your father gave you growing up, and just kind of always have the words that your mum said echoing in the back of your head about how you're nothing special and you're not significant. And every time one of these amazing experiences kind of falls in your lap, you're like second guessing yourself, and you have this major imposter syndrome just because the words that your mum said really stuck with you. And it really shows how people will carry negativity with them for the rest of their lives and forget all of the great things people say about them.
Yeah.
So that was there was 2 or 3 times where you had moments in the book where those words that your mum had said to you came back. So you wake up on this morning and things seem relatively normal. And then there is this event, this tragedy that your family experiences kind of out of the blue, out of nowhere, where you're informed by somebody that is a member of KSB that you don't really know that well, that your father has passed away from a heart attack.
Sure. Yes, that was so the night before my father died, we had a heavy downpour of rain, and we were in this tiny little hut. They call them rondavels. It's like a round hut with a thatch roof, and we were in the bottom row of like 50 rondavels, and the water was coming in under the door. And my dad the next morning got his spade out, and so we moved a lot when I was a child, but wherever we moved, my dad would plant a yellow daisy bush outside the front door. And so that morning he got the spade and he was digging a trench so that if it rained again, the trench would take the rainwater away. And we decided where he was going to plant the yellow daisy bush. And then I had to do the laundry, but I went up to the communal bathrooms and I did the laundry by hand. I washed it in the bath, and then it was too heavy. It was waterlogged and it was too heavy for me to carry. So I ran back down to go and ask my dad to come help me bring the washing down. And while I was running down to the rondavel, these men were running past me. And when I got down to the rondavel, there were like a whole bunch of people there. And someone said I can't go in, and I explained that what I need is, and then someone went with me to the bathroom and brought me back down. So I was hanging up our washing out on the line outside the rondavel, and I didn't know that my dad was fighting for his life inside. And then I looked up, and there was this combi that drove off at a high speed, and my mum was sitting in the passenger seat, and her face was just white and withdrawn, and she was just looking forward. And then someone came to me and took me inside the rondavel and said, my dad, I just had a heart attack. They don't know what's going to happen. And then they all left. And then I cried and fell asleep. And I just knew that my dad was going to die, because literally like 10 days before, I'd woken up one morning with just this absolute knowledge that one of my parents was going to die. And I prayed and I said, God, please don't let it be my dad. I can't live without my dad. And then when this happened, I thought, well, God's punishing me because obviously I wanted my mom to die. And it's not that I wanted my mom to die. I just really didn't want my dad to die. And then I woke up with Uncle Trevor sitting on the bed and saying, Erika, your father has died. And then he drove me up to Uncle Erlo. Now, Erlo Stegen's the head of the mission. At the time, we called him Uncle Erlo. Now I think of him with many other words, but not uncle. Anyway, he took me to Erlo's house, and I thought he was taking me to my mother, who was there. And he didn't. Erlo took me into a room, and it was a bedroom, and we sat on these twin beds with these like pinkish covers. And he said to me, your father has died. Do you know what that means? And I said, yes, he's gone to heaven. And he said, no, what it means is that if you ever want to see your father again, you may not have one unconfessed sin in your life, and you have to walk in the light. That was their favorite phrase. You walk in the light and live a godly life, and then you'll see your father again. And then he actually said to me, so now confess your sins. So I had to sit there and confess my sins. I have no idea what sins I confessed or what I made up. And only then was I allowed to go and to my mother. It was hectic. So there was all that from when I was younger, where I have to do so that I don't go to hell. But now they also had me seeing my father again to hold over me and control me in that way. Yeah.
And that narrative is something that is used against you for years and years, holding your relationship and the promise of seeing your father again hostage on the conditions that you follow KSB's rules and doctrines to the letter. And that kind of comes hand in hand with what we were talking about before we hit the record button, about how KSB weaponizes family members against one another, and that's how they're able to maintain so much control and so much unwavering loyalty by these sorts of situations. And that quote there that you said about Erlo saying, no, that's not what it means, Erika, what it means is that you must do all of these things if you ever want to see your father again, is actually one of the things that made me gasp, that we were talking about before we hit record, where I actually had to stop in the kitchen what I was doing and go back and actually revisit that part of the book, because I was so surprised by what was actually written there. And so that huge family tragedy, that horrible, like the worst thing that could have happened to you happens, and immediately that is just used as a tool to control you further. There's no time for you to grieve. There's no support. Your mum's not with you at that time. And again, that's one of the moments of the books where I was like, where is she? Why is she not with you? She should have been with you all night. You should never have been on your own. But again, that's coming at it from that very tunnel vision kind of perspective, where we don't really know what she was experiencing at that time, what Erlo had been saying to her, or, you know, what specifically transpired for your mum in those moments. So it's very easy for somebody on the outside to say, you know, why wasn't she there?
Yeah, why didn't she tell me about his death? Why did she send me?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know. They do not honor family relationships in the way that the outside world does. So I've come to learn that even between husband and wife, your counselor is still the most important person. So husbands and wives. So firstly, husbands are, of course, the master of all. But children and parents, you know, if you had a problem, you weren't encouraged to speak to your parents. You had to go to your counselor. So in those ways, they actually break down family relationships. They break down the bonds between a family as well by making the counselor the most important person in your life and not your family members. Yeah.
It's really strange, that dynamic when people explore it on this show, how you explained, you know, people on the outside world, secular relationships and family ties are almost replicated in high demand groups, but in terms of that love and commitment to those relationships is given to the headship of the movement. Yes. And it's kind of simple when it's explored in that way, but of course it's not as simple as just seeing your family members as other regular members of the religious group that you're aligned with, and not actually like your flesh and blood, people that you've had these familial experiences with growing up, you know, that you've made these connections and friendships with, you know, your father was your best friend. And so you, especially as members that joined, you know, after you'd had a little bit of lived experience, it just doesn't translate as easy as, you know, these are your family, but they're kind of not your family. This is your family, you know, these people in positions of power. And it's always really difficult for me as somebody that hasn't personally had one of these experiences to try and navigate in my own mind. And what you said about the education that you received in KSB is very similar to some of the episodes that we've done where we've covered the homeschooling situation in America, where a lot of the people that are experiencing or have experienced homeschooling, as Heather Grace Heath explored in my interview with her around her book Lovingly Abused, there's no accountability, there's no checkups on the curriculum. The curriculum itself for homeschooling and what the requirements are for somebody to be approved for homeschooling is completely lacking, and basically non-existent. And so there are children in those environments that just go months and months without anybody asking them if they've picked up a textbook, if they've finished, you know, homework or assignments that they're given. And so that was there's a few parallels between your book and Heather's, where she talks about Bill Gothard's IBLP and the Advanced Training Institute that I was drawing as we went through. And the other thing that you mentioned was the counsellors. So they've popped up a couple of times now. And before we go into that particular segment of the episode, I just wanted to say how sorry I was to read about your experiences around your father and how deeply I felt your grief during that time, and how sorry I was that you weren't allowed to grieve and that you weren't given that love and support during that time, because when I was growing up, my father was my best friend. And I can imagine how it would have been if he was to just not be there anymore, and what to do with that grief. And somebody once said to me, I think it's a quote from a famous person, but I'm not sure, so I'll have to look it up. But grief is like all the love that you would have given that person that you're not able to give them anymore. Yeah. So it's all built up, and it's everything, all that love and friendship that you would have given that person has nowhere to go anymore. So it just kind of lives in your chest, and it's just awful. And nobody should have to go through that experience on their own as a child. So I just wanted to tell you how sorry I was that is part of the experience that you had. And also, of course, this was the catalyst for the relationship between you and your mother to kind of break down even more than it already had done at this point.
Yes. She threw herself into schoolwork, and I basically lost my mother as well.
So that kind of was going to be a question of mine is, how did she react to this? Did she distance herself even further? Were there more kind of personality changes in your mum as time went on? Because your exchanges with the counsellors of KSB, it kind of came from your mother giving you ultimatums around the practices of KSB. So I don't know if it would be worth you kind of exploring that part for the listeners.
Yes. So at the time at KwaSizabantu, they had very few trained teachers, qualified teachers. So people like my mother were roped into teaching who had never taught in their entire lives. And so I imagine she had a lot of work, but I also think that she threw herself quite willingly into that work. So my mother and I were sharing one of those rondavels, and many nights I would lie awake and she wouldn't be home until very, very late. And I'd lie awake thinking that she was dead in a ditch somewhere, drowning, and I should go and fetch her. But I was too scared to go out in the middle of the night. And because there were communal meals, my mother and I never actually had any meals together, except when my brother or sister would come visit, and then she would actually make something. But for the rest of the time, I was pretty much left to my own devices. So
is this by design, do you think? Is this quite typical for most family members to kind of further breakdown of those strong relationships?
Very much so, yes. A lot of people I've spoken to, it's rare to find a family that actually had meals together every night, and those obviously the parents who kind of insisted on it. But I think for a lot of parents it was just easier to have their children kind of run wild a little, because they were in such a constrained environment. Like everybody was your parent, like anybody could hit you and give you punishment for anything you did. So like I was basically parented by everybody, except I didn't need much parenting, because I really became like a little shadow child. I was so scared to put a foot wrong that I didn't actually ever really put a foot wrong. But so this first year after my father died, I was 15, and then I turned 16. It was unbelievably hectic and sore and traumatic for me, because I felt I couldn't grieve for him, because it was God's will that he died. And if I grieve too much, then I'm rebelling against God's will, I remember the one night I was crying really hard shortly after he died. My sister was in the room with us, and my mother at some point just said from her bed, be quiet now, Erika, you're going to wake up your sister. Like there was no comfort really. It was, Then, but I didn't have a counselor, because we had come from Johannesburg and come to KwaSizabantu. And so I didn't have a counselor at KwaSizabantu that I was confessing my sins to, which was mandated in the school policy that you had to confess your sins. And I didn't for a whole year. I just coasted because I was so unsupervised. I thought that nobody was noticing this. But at the end of that year, my mother sat me down, and guess what? She prayed. You're always in trouble when your mother sits and prays with you. And then she said to me that the school board had met, and that because I had gone for a whole year without confessing my sins, they were going to expel me. And I thought, well, that's not the end of the world. I mean, like, I'm learning by myself anyway. It's just going to spare me from going to assembly every morning and getting another sermon. But then she said, because she's part of this community now and a teacher at the school, if the school expelled me, that means that she would have to kick me out of the house as well. So I would have to pack a little suitcase and walk up to the main road and hitchhike a ride somewhere and go and make a life for myself somewhere. So I, of course, started crying. I was petrified, and I begged her, please, can I stay? And she said, well, you need to find a counselor before school reopens, and you need to go to them regularly, and then they would allow me to stay. And that was at least one thing that I had choice over, was who my counselor was. They didn't tell you who your counselor had to be. Well, they didn't tell me. And so I chose a man who, when he preached, he brought some history into it. So it was always a little bit more interesting. He obviously knew a lot of history, and history was one of my favorite subjects. And so I asked him, his name's Muzi Gunene, I asked him if he would be my counselor, and he said, yes, he would be my counselor. And so I started going for counseling with Muzi. And I was therefore allowed to remain at the school and finish my schooling. Yeah.
This was a really exciting part of the book, because you kind of had this intuition about this person that he might engage in some of those conversations that you kind of knew other counselors would not be having, around kind of like, why did things happen this way, and giving you some historical education on things that KSB might not have wanted you to know about, like apartheid or the scramble for Africa, and the specifics around the politics and stuff. Yes. And you actually did start to have these conversations.
I loved it. And I blossomed, because I was suddenly, here was somebody who was paying me attention. He became a father figure to me. He like took the place of my dad. And he because he was Black, he could teach me about apartheid and what it was like. And I had no idea. And I learned so much from him, history-wise and everything. Yes. And honestly, he and I grew very close to his children. He was married with 2 children at the time. The youngest little girl, she was about 4 years old, and she had muscular dystrophy. So she was severely disabled. And I ended up spending 2 or 3 hours a day with her, teaching her English and doing exercises with her. And I just completely fell in love with this little girl, Miriam. And I would spend my afternoons with her. And so him being my counselor brought a lot of love into my life, which was, I needed it so much. It was like I was just soaking up all this affection and this love, especially coming from his children.
So your kind of air quotes confession sessions, kind of, they just turn into like study group, and actually it's just like you get to do more actual hands-on schooling in these so-called confessions. Than you were doing in the time prior to this, where you were not checked up on whatsoever. And you talked about kind of having a lack of intimacy and a lack of love and affection in your life at that time. And KSB is kind of a big no on all things affectionate. So it wouldn't be common to see people hugging one another or anything like that. So you're a young child who's lost her father, and then you kind of grow up kind of from that moment. It's just continuous kind of loneliness. And then when Muzi reaches out to offer you some of that affection, it's greatly received.
Yes.
But then
So I remember I was 17 years old. It was the year after my father had died. And it was my father's birthday, the 24th of August. And I was speaking to Muzi, and I was crying about my dad. And we stood up to say goodbye, and he gave me a hug. And it felt amazing to be hugged and comforted. But that was when our relationship shifted and changed. Yes. Yeah. And gradually he started grooming me, and the hugs would become tighter, and then the caressing started. and eventually the kissing, him forcing his tongue in my mouth. When I say forcing, I mean, I didn't say no, I didn't protest. I didn't understand. It was so confusing. I was so confused. Yeah.
I feel like there's a big difference between vocalizing and non-vocalizing your consent in those situations. And of course, as you said, it's not as simple as you just saying yes or no to the advances of somebody older who is a prominent figure within KSB, who is a male in KSB, which holds its own significance, a married man at that, with his own children. And so all of these things, they imply difficulty in your situation. It's not as easy as it might sound for people kind of listening on the outside looking in, for you to just stop those advances by saying no thank you.
Absolutely, because he's a man of God, and a man of God can do no wrong. Actually, can I read you a short passage from my book?
Yes, please. Yes.
Where I write about this. Let me quickly find it. Here we go. So, because there is a ban on sex education, children, especially girl children, are not taught that when someone touches you inappropriately, you speak up. You know that something is wrong, but you don't know what exactly. And this is the man of God who is touching you inappropriately, but you're not 100% sure that he's touching you inappropriately. And how could he be touching you inappropriately when he's a man of God? So whatever is inappropriate here is obviously inside you. You are evil. You are bad. You are just the worst person on earth. Firstly, because you're a woman. And secondly, because this is a man of God. You are completely, totally, utterly vulnerable to abuse. You have no boundaries. You have no knowledge. You have no voice. And that sums up what girl children and boy children experience there is. And because these counselors they're not trained counselors. It actually irks me to use the word counselors, because I now consider counselors good people. But because they're placed in such a position of authority, and when you confess your sins, you are in a room alone with them. The possibilities for abuse is just endless, actually. And it's just horrific. So, but I had a lot of disquiet around this, and I was actually severely anorexic at this time as well. I was eating maybe half a slice of bread every second day. Firstly, because their food wasn't great, and later I recognized, when I started learning about things after I left, was that what I put in my mouth was the only thing I controlled. So it was the only thing I had control over. And so that's quite normal. It wasn't that I wanted to be skinny. It was more about I didn't have an appetite for anything. And this just got worse and worse. And one day, so we were taught that lust is like the worst sin. Now, we had, obviously not having had sex education or anything, I had a very nebulous understanding of what lust is, but I knew that it happened between a man and a woman who weren't married. That was lust. And because I was 17 at this time, my body obviously reacted to his advances. I had a physical response, and it was something I hadn't experienced before, and I decided this must be lust. But I didn't realize that I was feeling it because he was kissing me, because he said to me, I mustn't tell anybody what goes on between us, because nobody would understand the special love that we share. Okay, so he silenced me. And then one day I realized I knew of a way to make him stop doing this, because I didn't want it. And I thought, if I tell him that I have feelings of lust towards him, then maybe he will stop what he's doing, because he won't want me to sin. So I confessed to him that I had feelings of lust towards him. And what did the fucker do? He took me to Erlo, and he sat there and he said, please tell Uncle Erlo what you told me. Now, KwaSizabantu says that confession is sacred and it stays between you and your counselor. Well, that has been proved a complete lie many times over, but this also goes to prove it, because he made me tell Uncle Elo what I had confessed. And then Uncle Elo railed against me, called me a Delilah, a slut, a marriage wrecker, didn't for 1 minute consider that a 17-year-old girl who has no sex education is obviously the victim here. And, the married man who has authority over her. But anyway, I would later learn that Elo actually silenced a lot of abuse victims in this way. He told me that I wasn't allowed to speak about this to anyone, not even my own mother. He gave me that specific instruction. And then he told me I'm not allowed to have anything to do with Muzi or his children. So just like that, little Miriam and Sebenzi, his son, I suddenly wasn't allowed to have any contact with them. And Muzi sat there looking at me the whole time. And I, because he's a man of God, I knew that I was just the worst person ever. But Muzi didn't stop calling me to come and see him. So this carried on, even though Elo had forbidden it. So I was like torn between this one man of God who had forbidden me to have anything to do with this man, but he's also a man of God and he was still calling me and fondling me and kissing me. So it was an untenable situation, really.
And as you said about the other cases that have since come out that Elo has silenced, is it even comprehensible to consider the level of these abuses, that the entire spectrum that people may have experienced during this time? Because you're experiencing significant grooming,
yes,
and spiritual abuse,
yes,
and misogyny at this time. What are others who have not come forward experienced under the guise of counselors?
Yeah. Let me just say that this kind of happened to me like around about 1988. But from 1982, Elo was already aware that Muzi was being sexually inappropriate with people. And he just refused to hear it. Some of the other things that have happened is a young girl, age 18, was raped by her counselor. She went straight from being raped to Elo's house and refused to leave until he spoke to her. She told him what had just happened. He made her confess and repent her sin of making a man of God stumble. And then he sent her away saying, "Do not speak of this to anyone, including your mother." Now, she had all the evidence in and on her body. If he had taken her to the police, there would have been a successful case of rape against this man. Now, KwaSizabantu says that she can't be believed because why didn't she go to the police? So this is just one. There was another woman that I've spoken to personally. She was raped. She was a minor at the time. He told her to repent, to not speak of it. And they are discrediting her because she has actually come forward with her name and her story. And they have invested a lot to discredit her story and say the sex was consensual and her story doesn't line up. And why did she never go to the police? I know of one case where a man was abusing his 12-year-old daughter. It came to their attention. They spoke to him to stop it. The girl is still now, she's there now. She's a teacher there now. She's an adult. And she praises KwaSizabantu for making her father stop abusing her, right? But what comes through so clearly is that they knew this was a pedophile living in this house with his children. And they allowed him to stay. He left of his own accord sometime after that. And who knows how many little girls he had access to before he died. They let him go. There's another young man who they made housemaster of the boarding school of the boys. He sodomized a whole number of boys. And when it was brought to their attention, they at first wouldn't believe it. Then when they finally believed it, they had this guy leave quietly. He's gone off. He can go and do this to lots of other boys outside. So they are only concerned with protecting their reputation. and they silence the victims. They tell them to repent their sin of making a man of God stumble. So it becomes the victim's sin. And then when the victim grows up and actually goes, you fuckers, this is what you did, they go, you can't believe her. Why hasn't she gone to the police? But they are the ones who silenced us. And my abuser went on to murder a woman, and he's sitting in jail for murder today. You know, who knows what would have happened if they had just not enabled him to and made him believe that he was above the law. Who knows whether he would have murdered this woman.
There's so many things. I mean, again, weaponizing your family. You can't speak to your mother. You can't tell anybody that this happened. You know, Muzi was continuing to be a counsellor six years or so before you had your first interactions with him. If they were aware of this, why was he allowed to continue being somebody's one-to-one counsellor in intimate environments? What?
And you know, after I left, and we'll get to how I escaped and everything, but after I left, I started realizing what had happened to me and what he had done to me. And I actually made a point of making an appointment with Elo, and I went back to KwaSizabantu and I had a meeting with Elo, and I said to him, you accused me of being a Delilah, but let me just tell you how this happened and how it happened. And he was like, oh, this is terrible. We're going to demote Muzi. He's not going to be allowed to be around young women anymore and young girls anymore. And then 2 weeks later, I opened the newspaper and there's this huge, big photograph, quarter of a page photograph of Muzi Kunene, and they are praising him for starting an organization called Christians for Truth. So I picked up the phone. I was so angry. I picked up the phone and I phoned Elo and got put through to him. And I said to him, Uncle Elo, you told me Muzi would be demoted. He would be stopped from having any position of power. And I'm looking at the Natal Witness and I'm seeing him here. And he's smiling in this photo and they glorifying him. And do you know what Elo said to me? He said, Erika, I don't remember what we spoke about. Can you refresh my memory? And that's when I knew, like, fuck this. He knows. He knew what Muzi was up to, and he protected him. So they mustn't come and say, oh, you know, these are like odd little things that happened, one-off things that happened, and they created an environment that allowed abuse to happen. They silenced the victims and they protected the abusers. And I don't see how anything has changed because they are unwilling to express any kind of remorse for what they did and what they've done.
And it's not just circumstantial, these allegations, it's your personal lived experience. And Muzi even wrote to you at some point to explain how sorry he was, but obviously was an incredibly empty attempt at reconciliation because he was worried about being outed as you started your activism work. Yes.
He wrote to me when I started my activism work and he said, if I ever did anything to hurt you, and I basically just wrote back to him and I was like, you can stick your apology until what did you do to me? Tell me, what did you do to me? And until you can face that and until you go and see a therapist for your sexual deviancy, don't freaking speak to me again. Yeah.
And so he's murdered a person now.
Yes. So he left KwaSizabantu and he he was renting a place from an estate agent, and he lured her to come to him. He was promising her to pay the deposit that he was owing her, and instead he got his son and two of his son's friends to help him, and they actually drove her in her car up to the mountains and set her alight in her car. And then when his son decided to turn state witness against him, he tried to kill his son. Yeah. He shot his son, but he didn't kill him. No, he's a psychopath. Well, I can't say that because I'm not a licensed psychologist, but there's something seriously wrong with him. But they enabled him.
And this is just because he was like short on a few months' rent.
Oh. Yeah, then he got his son to try and to cash some checks, her personal checks, and that's actually how they caught him. And then he had this whole story of how the apartheid regime or the regime had changed someone's face by plastic surgery to look like him, to target him. Ach no, man, he lives in a fantasy world. But yeah, the stuff he said to News 24 in 2020 about me, but we can get to that. Oh my gosh, this is such a long story.
Well, I'm severely glad that he is not in a place where he is able to carry out any more of this pathological hurt against anybody. That poor estate agent,
her family. Yeah. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, but in South Africa, life imprisonment doesn't mean you're there for life. And you can get out basically after serving 10 years.
It's kind of like that here as well, 20 to 25 years. Yeah.
So I am actually quite scared of him, and I have reason to be.
Absolutely, rightly so. Yeah. I mean, you've named him in your book after kind of deliberating for a long time whether you were going to publicly name him or not.
Yeah. I just decided that I'm so sick of men hiding behind
other men.
Fear. Yeah, and women's fear. Like, I was scared to name him, and then I decided, no, screw that. I've got to name him. I've had death threats. Where they come from, I haven't been able to establish. The police hasn't been able to establish. But I am scared of that fucker. But at some point you just have to tell the world, this man will make you believe he's like the best person on earth, but he's evil, and just warn people against him. And I knew he had other victims, and I just kind of also wanted them to know that it wasn't them, it was him. I thought, if I name him, then I can give them some measure of peace, that it didn't just happen to them. Yeah.
I just don't understand why Erlo would risk the reputation of KSB or the inner workings of the whole regime by allowing people to remain in these positions where they have this type of access to vulnerable people after he knows that it's happening. I does it not serve his best interests to remove those people from those situations in case somebody does decide to do what you've done one day and just blow the whole thing wide open? I just don't, from a self-preservation standpoint, I don't understand why he allows these things to happen, because he obviously doesn't care for the well-being of individuals. He doesn't care about the actions that these predators are carrying out. He's more concerned about saving face. So I just wonder why he doesn't find out about these people and then say, you shouldn't be counseling anymore because I know what you're going to be trying to accomplish in those sessions.
Well, it kind of makes you wonder what he was doing behind closed doors.
Well, yeah, I was thinking that before, and I didn't even let my mind kind of go that far.
Yeah, I'm just asking the questions. I'm not making any allegations. I'm just asking the questions. Is why would you protect sexual predators? Why? What do they know about you?
Also, in February, there was a segment on my social media where I was focusing on Eating Disorders Awareness Month. And there were a few cases that we've had on the show where I was looking at those parallels. And so I was really kind of taken aback to read about your personal experiences with anorexia, but not surprised at the same time. And it's so horrible to even hear myself say that it's kind of shocking that in high demand religions, children and young adults are allowed to obviously be emaciated or in a state of bones and skinniness, and have an obvious issue when it came to relationships with food. It surprises me that in some high demand religious groups where everything is controlled so meticulously that children and young adults are even able to find themselves in those positions. It's even more shocking to me that it's so common across these groups that people have these really difficult relationships with food. And again, as you said, just comes back to the power of really the only thing you could control was your calorie intake.
Yes.
And it really is that simple.
And I think it was also about, developing breasts. And I was so indoctrinated that being a woman means that you're a stumbling block. Like, I didn't want to be a woman because all I was going to do was cause men to sin. And I was so not wanting to have curves, because if my curves would lead men into sin, then it was my fault. I would be the one who was the sinner because I was causing men to sin. So I think it was that as well that was playing into me not nourishing my body, because I didn't value my body. I didn't want to be in this body. I didn't want to be in this body. And so depriving my body of what it needs to survive was actually me saying, I don't want to survive. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in this body. Yeah.
Would there have been the opportunity for somebody to recognize your condition and help you get access to some type of medical intervention?
Well, I mean, I was living with my mother, and I was 19 years old, and I was wearing clothes that had on their tags for girls 12 to 13 years. But I was 19 years old. So, I mean, how, yeah, it's just, you see, nobody can believe that people are unhappy there, because you're supposed to be so with God. And I don't think they acknowledge ill health, mental health disorders at all. You're either a sinner or you're not. I mean, they allow you to get medical care, if you can afford it, for medical ailments, for physical ailments, but they won't acknowledge that there's such a thing as depression, or I don't even think they would have recognized anorexia. I have somebody who reached out to me last year, and she told me her story of how she actually was sent by her parents because she had anorexia, and how her health just became worse because nobody there gave her any specific guidance or any help with her eating disorder. It's just something they don't recognize. They don't recognize mental health illnesses.
I suppose if you are supposed to internalize negative feelings and work on them yourself to ensure that you're not sinful and to ensure that you are following God's will in the way that KSB says that you should be, and any kind of outward negative expressions may cause someone to snitch on you, or may cause beatings, or may cause you to have to go and confess with a guy who is obviously grooming and abusing you,
yes,
then you might not talk about how unhappy you are. And you might not even allow yourself to really explore the fact that you're unhappy, because then if you internalize those thoughts, you have to then have that big thing with yourself around how do you prevent this sin. And actually, if you just think, I'm not unhappy, I'm happy, because you don't want to allow yourself to maybe feel sinful. And so obviously that cognitive dissonance stops there, but maybe everybody is unhappy. It's just nobody is talking about it, because if you talk about it, there are all these consequences.
I definitely became divorced from my feelings and my body there. And it's been a long road, and I haven't completely successfully integrated my feelings and my body as a whole. I'm still very often just in my head rather than in my body. But yeah, I think a lot of people experienced just divorcing themselves from their feelings and from their bodies. You have to, in order to survive. Yeah.
In terms of the misogyny that is present within KSB, we've spoken a little bit about that, and Erlo's personal stance on those accounts of historical abuse that he has covered up. What other examples can you give us of the men versus women mentality that exists in KSB, or at least did when you were a member of KSB?
Yes. Yeah, because I mean, what KwaSizabantu keeps throwing at me is that I left 3 decades ago. And how can I know that it's still, things are still happening there? But how I know they're still happening there is because there's been no sense, there's been no remorse and no recognition of what they did wrong. So there's been no change, because without remorse and recognition, there is no change. So they refuse to acknowledge they did anything wrong. So, like I said, I was very, very definitely aware that as a woman, I was a lesser being. I was there to serve men. So, as a girl child, I was the property of my parents, and I would remain the property of my parents until I married, and then I would transfer to being the property of my husband. So, for example, if I only got married when I was 27, I would remain under my mother's thumb, and I would have to listen to her and obey her in everything until the day that I got married. And then I would have to listen to my husband and obey my husband in everything he said. So as a woman, I am just, I'm there to serve men and to not make men stumble. It's my responsibility to stop men from sinning and to ensure that they don't sin. Because if they sin, it's because of me, and because of women that they sin. And this of course primed me for abuse in relationships later in life after I'd left the mission. And I've spoken to a number of women who grew up there and who actually ended up in abusive relationships after they left KwaSizabantu, because they didn't know any better. And what I actually write in my book is, after a lifetime of silencing my intuition when it comes to men, I've grown really good at ignoring red flags. I don't realize it, of course. I like to think that I've become more enlightened, but the indoctrination I got at KwaSizabantu, that women are inferior to men, that we have to guard against leading men astray, that we're whores, sluts, and Delilahs, left an indelible impression. This despite the fact that intellectually I've known for years that their ideas about gender roles are totally unsound. So it took me a long time and a marriage to an absolutely awful narcissist to actually really realize that I needed some proper delving deep and healing. Yeah.
It's kind of like men have a get out of jail free card in these situations.
Totally.
Another point that I wanted to focus on as well, which you cover quite extensively in your book, is the difference in the treatment between white members of KSB and non-white members of KSB. And the only reason I say non-white is because in my conversation with Daniel, he mentioned that actually it was people, it had nothing to do with your kind of your ethnicity in terms of whether you were from parts of Europe or from parts of Australia or from parts of America or predominantly white dominated countries. It was more about the color of your skin. Yes. So a lot of the historical racism that exists in these high demand religious groups, including KSB, from the evidence that's been presented to at least me, yes. This is still the case.
Very much so. So I think that so our law is now very old and apparently has Alzheimer's and is severely cognitively impaired. So his hold on the whole place is more in people's minds rather than him being able to speak coherently about anything. And as a result, his second in command is now a woman, Lydia Dube, and she was someone he apparently raised from the dead in the 1970s, yeah, right.
During his actual implementation of KSB, right? Okay, so
he raised her from the dead. She died, went to heaven, and then came back to life anyway, she's now the kind of the de facto leader, even though they haven't told their congregation that Elo has dementia or severe cognitive disabilities. And I believe I've heard from people who left recently that Black people are now being treated better there as a result of Lydia kind of being in charge. But when I was there, the disparity was very obvious. And after they started the school, it became even more glaringly so. The Black children were treated abominably compared to us. And as you've heard, like my ride was hardly sunshine and happiness, but they had it so much worse. And what actually happened is every Saturday, the Black children would be called into a service and us whites would be excluded. And they would have these things where counselors would openly discuss what some of the children had confessed to them. And then that child would be called up and they would be beaten in public and very often stripped to their underwear and beaten. And they would be beaten until they were bleeding. Oh. My Black friends today are walking around with physical scars on their backs, buttocks, and thighs from being beaten by these people until they were bleeding. And we're talking about 40, 50 lashes. Now, my publishers wouldn't let me publish in my book that many people have said there was one instance where a boy got given 70 lashes, because my publisher said that sounds impossible, but there are so many people who witnessed it who say that is what happened. And I can believe it, because they would just beat you until their bloodlust was satisfied. And so the white children, yes, we were beaten horribly, and some of us experienced being beaten like that. We were never stripped naked, and we were never like systematically tortured in that way. It was more like you did something wrong, boom, you punished these kids. I mean, in the one chapter of my book, I actually call it pink panties. My one friend tells me how every Saturday she would ensure that her knickers were pretty, at least, so that if she was stripped down to her knickers, she would at least have pretty knickers on, right? The abuse the Black children suffered, I mean, yeah, it's very hard for me to explain it because I didn't experience it myself, but I can tell you, I have the written testimonies of more than 70 people. And when I read those testimonies, I weep because, oh man, and they were given inferior food. I mean, I didn't enjoy the food that I was eating, but they remember at least once where there was actually some maggots or some worms in their food and they didn't want to eat it. And then they were punished for being fussy eaters. And they were forced to eat the food that was so clearly off. I mean, yeah, it's insane. And later, then it also came out that just in terms of wages, the people who actually work for wages, because many people are just volunteers, but some people work for wages. The disparity in wages between Black and white was also huge, huge. And we can still get to marriage, but can I just say that in 50 years of existence, there has not been a single interracial marriage at all, ever, not once. Now, this is a racially integrated society, and yes, whites are treated better than Blacks, but how is it possible that not one interracial marriage has ever happened? Is it God that's racist, or is it KwaSizabantu? Yeah.
So there's a theme of second-class citizens that exist in KSB, whether that is women or whether that is non-white persons that exist in KSB. And I'm sure, of course, there's probably many other community groups that exist in KSB that people don't even recognize or are aware of existing, such as the LGBT community.
Oh no.
This does not even sound like a community where you could even tell your parents in secret that you were attracted to the same sex, or that you didn't feel like you conformed to your given at birth gender.
No, that is something so far out of any, no, I mean, just completely no.
What was it like in KSB for yourself and for also Zulu citizens that exist in KSB around things like personal possessions, relationships, leisure time?
So they kind of control the hours of your day quite significantly. There are 3 church services a day, except on Sundays when there's one big one during the day and then an evening one. And unless you're at school or actually working at something there, you have to attend those church services. So you're spending hours a day in a church service, which seriously controls your time. You are allowed personal possessions, but it's kind of frowned upon unless you're one of the leaders, and then you drive around in the latest Mercedes-Benz and you have 4 private airplanes at your disposal, and your mansion has an indoor heated swimming pool. But everybody else, you mustn't get attached to worldly things. And in fact, they very often have fire services where you bring everything that's worldly, whether it's TVs or books or CDs or jewelry or anything that's worldly, and they burn it in big bonfires. So there are no radios, no TVs. Okay, they have a radio station now, Radio Kwezi. So I assume you're allowed radios. And I suppose with the internet now, they're very visible on social media. KwaSizabantu is, even though Elo preached that if your name is on Facebook, it is not in the book of life. But they're using social media to try and rehabilitate their image. But so you're not encouraged to have possessions. You're definitely encouraged to give everything you have to the mission. They'll deny it, but it's one of those things that you just know that they might never have written down as a rule, but everybody knows it and abides by it.
Kind of like no kind of integrated marriages or interracial, kind of like with no interracial marriages.
Yes, Ella would explain it and say that animals don't copulate interspecies. You know, you wouldn't have one species of an antelope with another species of an antelope, or you wouldn't have a lion lying down with sheep, you know, and that's how he justified there not being any interracial marriages.
And you mentioned briefly before that we haven't talked about the marriage ceremonies yet, and this is a particularly interesting part of of your story and the book. And also this was where I think Daniel first mentioned your name to me as well, which is how we're having this conversation today. So thank you very much, Daniel, if you're listening.
Yes, Daniel.
Please talk us through this part of KSB. I feel like it's one of the earmarks of this particular movement that sets it aside from many other high demand religious groups that have an anchor using the Bible and Christianity. So please talk us through this part.
So on the 9th of January this year, 2022, my oldest niece got married at KwaSizabantu. And they broadcast their services live on YouTube. So I was watching her get married on YouTube. And Lydia Dube spoke, and she said that when the revival came down, God changed the rules. Now, how God changed the rules is that men and women and boys and girls don't have relationships with each other. God shows the man who his wife is to be. The man goes to the leaders, the leader of the mission. At the time, it was Elo Stegen, but now that he's flying, he's no longer capable of having a conversation. I suppose they go to some other leader, possibly Lydia. and says he feels it on his heart that God wants him to marry Erika. Let's just take me for an example. Elo then calls me in and says, Erika, so-and-so, feels it's God's will for you to get married. You need to go and pray about it. Don't discuss this with anyone. So in other words, don't discuss this with your parents. Don't discuss this with anyone. You pray and you come and tell me what God wants you to do. Okay, now I wrote my final school exam when I was 18. And I think it was a day or 2 days later, I got my first marriage proposal in this way. Strangely enough, God always has an eye for the pretty outgoing girls first. So I was 18 when I got my first marriage proposal in this way. And now everybody said that God spoke to them. God never spoke to me. And I knew when Alo said, go and pray about it and ask God what his will is for your life, I knew that I was going to pray about it, but I wasn't going to get an answer because there was something wrong with me and because God never spoke to me. But anyway, off I went and prayed. And I came back to Elo, and I don't know where I got the courage from, but I said to him, God isn't giving me the freedom that God hasn't told me. This doesn't feel like it's God's will for my life. Meantime, I just couldn't actually imagine being married to the dweeb. And Ella was very taken aback. But then over the next 2 years, God told 2 other men that it was his will for them to marry me. So the second proposal came. And this is actually, I thought, quite a good guy. And, if I'd married him, we probably would have had a good life. He has since left the mission with his family because God obviously showed him another woman to marry. Because I also said no to the second one. And the third one, I was close to leaving. I didn't know it yet, but I was close to leaving. And when Elo told me who it was, it's a man and I despise his brother. I didn't know him, of course, but I knew who his brother was, and it's a man I really despise. Not that I was allowed to despise anyone, but I did. And when Elo said that to me, I said to him in that conversation, no. And my answer is no. And Elo was like, aren't you going to pray about it? And I said, I can't believe that God would want me to marry that man. So no, I'm not going to pray about it. And Elo got really angry with me, really, really angry. So that's what happened. So, and then the engagement is announced in front of the whole congregation. And this coming Sunday, my second niece is getting engaged to someone. So the leader stands between the 2 people getting engaged, and he puts the ring on the woman's finger and says, you're now engaged. The 2 fiancés don't speak to each other. They are never alone in a room. The first time, so then they get married in front of the whole church. And again, it is Elo who puts the wedding ring on the woman's finger. Not even her new husband is doing that. It's actually so creepy if you think of it.
It is
really creepy. So then they have the reception with lots of food, no alcohol. There's never any alcohol at KwaSizabantu. And then after the reception, and I know this because my one friend who got married this way told me what happened. He's a man. He told me that they were called then to Elo's house. Now remember, they are young people who've grown up here. They have no sex education. So Elo called him in first by himself. They don't even go in together to get this talk. He goes in by himself. Elo sits him down and says, look, you're allowed to have sex now. And you should have sex because we need to procreate, but you may have trouble finding the hole at first, but don't worry, it's going to come right. Then he said to him that they mustn't use birth control, but that if he wanted to have sex with his wife when she was in the 10-day danger zone, which he kind of explained to him, when it was 2 weeks after her period, there was a week or 10 days where it was, and they didn't want to fall pregnant, then he needed to put a towel on the bed next to his wife and ejaculate into the towel instead of into his wife. And that was the extent of his sex education. I said to him, did he not say anything about lubrication or getting your wife aroused? And like, no. Only allowed to kiss on the mouth, not allowed to put your mouth anywhere else. And then he told me later that he asked his wife what her conversation was like. And he was in there for about 2 minutes, and she was in there for even shorter. And she said basically what she was told is that she has to have sex with her husband whenever he wants it. So that was the extent of her sex education. So you can imagine how much marital rape occurs and in that environment, and how awful sex must actually be. But the absolutely awful thing is that as a woman, you've been so cut off from your sexuality, because, and even as a guy, because everything, you can't even think about sex. Like, there's no masturbation allowed, like, you know. And now suddenly it's like there's a switch that has to happen, and now suddenly it's okay, and actually now you have to have it even when you don't want it. It's just, yeah, it's just so wrong. The whole way is so wrong, you know.
There's a lot around the expectation of women to carry children as well, and to have children, because of course it's not something that's always achievable with a woman's body or a man's body not producing what is needed for the woman to fall pregnant, which I know from other conversations is often, you know, it could never be the man's fault. It can only ever be the woman's fault. But there are also the implications of how long after having kids is a woman given to recover before she's expected to start having sex again. That just makes my whole body tense up, even just contemplating that.
Yeah.
How many children will a woman bear if there is no contraception? If the man decides that he doesn't want to ejaculate onto a towel, how can she say no to no more children? You know, there's been so many cases on the show where people have talked about women being in danger from continuous pregnancies that are harmful for their bodies, or difficult labors that have put them in or through near-death experiences. And then there's all of the psychological implications that come with continuously having children and being in that survival mode of newborn territory.
Yeah.
And where is the woman's ability to just say no to any of that? There's no autonomy whatsoever for the female's body. And actually, there are so many expectations of men in these high demand religious groups to continuously bring children into the world as well. So many implications that come with these relationship expectations inside high demand religious groups. But the particular the particular rituals around KSB and the engagement and the marriage is just so strange. And
you're marrying a complete stranger, and you're not allowed to have any feelings for them until the day God sanctions you, and now suddenly you must turn all those feelings on.
That's dangerous even in itself, because who knows what could be awakened for a man and a woman in those particular situations, because I believe that there must be many cases where men are actually abused in various situations and could never come forward and talk about that because of the misogyny inside these groups, and because of the expectation that the man is the person of power in the family, in the household, and throughout the entire religious movement. So goodness knows how many men there are experiencing various types of trauma and abuse in their own households behind closed doors where nobody can see what's happening.
Yes. This friend who told me about the sex education he got on his marriage day, he was in an abusive relationship. His wife abused him. But yeah, God wanted you to get married, so you're in this for life, you know. The only time you're allowed to divorce is when your spouse leaves KwaSizabantu and you don't want to leave and you want to keep the children, and then they'll encourage and help you to get a divorce and to actually keep your spouse from ever having contact with the children again. They'll make it as hard for the spouse who leaves as possible. That's the only time they advocate divorce.
There's so many things that you said in the section around proposals. Of course, is it God's will for 3 different men to propose to you? I don't believe that KSB practices polygamy, but that kind of suggests that, you know, maybe they should be, because there is more than one man who has seen a vision from God of you two being married. But then I feel like there's this implied but non-spoken knowledge that obviously God doesn't tell you that that's the man you're supposed to marry. You're kind of supposed to just say, oh yeah, he came to me and said that we are supposed to marry. No, I feel like nobody's really having these experiences, but everybody's saying that they are. Like when people have talked about speaking in tongues, how they've just suddenly been able to do it, and it's because they've just started speaking gibberish, and then they realize in that moment that that's just what everybody else has been doing the whole time.
Yes, yeah. But in that time, you know, I felt like such a complete misfit, because I didn't have this relationship with God that they preached about. And I'm starting to realize that it's all in their heads, and it's not actually a real relationship with God. You know, like, I don't think God is speaking to anybody there except saying, get the hell out of this place. But you feel like such an imposter, and you just pretend that you're experiencing everything that everybody else is experiencing, because the thought that you're not one of them is too horrible to comprehend.
You're kind of rubbing Erlo up the wrong way doesn't end here. You just kind of carry on, and you've been a thorn in his side from the beginning. And I just think that it's so great, because somebody needs to be or to have been.
Can I just say on this whole thing
absolutely.
of men being the be all and end all, it absolutely tickles me pink that Erlo produced 6 daughters and not a single male heir. It's like God is maybe giving him a sign. I don't know.
Your journey out of KSB, it's quite a beautiful one, really, in terms of unexpected allies and support from various different places, unexpected places, which we can kind of explore and go into now as we talk about kind of how, why, and when you left KSB. But there's this huge final segment to go through around your activism work and the path that your life has taken since leaving KSB. So I kind of wanted to just give you the floor here to just talk us through kind of how, why, and when you left, and what your activism journey has looked like up until the point where you decided to finally write Mission of Malice.
Yes. So I have this wonderful uncle who's my father's brother that he came to visit South Africa. He had left South Africa many years ago. And he came to visit us at KwaSizabantu, and he said to the same aunt of mine who lived a little bit away in Pietermaritzburg, not far from KwaSizabantu, he said, we've got to get Erika out of that place. So he said to me, okay, Erika, so you can speak French and German, but you know, the best places to really polish those languages are in France and Germany. So my wife, Janet, and I would like to buy you a ticket to go to Europe and buy you a 3-month Eurail pass. That means you can travel wherever you want to in Europe. And my mother said, okay, Erika, you can go, but on condition that you stay with KwaSizabantu people. Like, they had a lot of people belonging to KwaSizabantu in Europe who were kind of their cash cows, I think. They really milked them for donations. And so she allowed me to go. I turned 21 in Germany. But I did have 2 visits to my aunt and uncle in Sweden. And so even though I was very much with my aunt and uncle, then offered to sponsor me to go to university in Europe. And I phoned my mother, very delighted. And she said, no, you promised that you were coming back in January, and you are coming back in January. Now, I was already 21 years old and an adult, but I didn't know that because like I explained before, until the day I married, my mother was still in charge of me. So I returned to KwaSizabantu, and the norm is that when you return, you have to go and greet all the elders and all the important people and say, hello, I'm back. And they ask you, how are you, Erika? And you're like, I'm fine, thank you. God is good, wada, wada, wada. And so I went to greet Muzi in this newly built Christians for Truth office. And he pinned me up against the wall and fondled me and kissed me. And I was just like, I cannot live like this. I cannot live like this. So I told my mother that I had a present for my Aunt Iris from my uncle and aunt in Sweden, and that I wanted to visit her for the weekend. I phoned my aunt and I said, Tannie Iris, can I come and visit? And she said, of course, my child. And so I had to have my mother's permission to leave KwaSizabantu to get a lift to go to Pietermaritzburg. And so I packed a tiny little bag. Didn't have many toiletries because, like, really just soap and cream and a hairbrush and shampoo, but very little clothes, so that because I was only going for 2 nights. And then when I got to my aunt, I said, I can't go back there. And my aunt said, you don't have to, you can stay with me. And I phoned my brother. He was in the army at the time, and he drove to come and see me. And my aunt phoned my mother on the Sunday to tell her that I wouldn't be returning to work at KwaSizabantu, but that I was going to get a job in Pietermaritzburg. And so I got a job in Pietermaritzburg, but I still went back sometimes to try and repair my relationship with my mother, even though I knew that by choosing to leave KwaSizabantu, I was choosing to potentially be kicked out of my family as well. And to this day, my mother says that it was my decision to have nothing to do with her, because I knew that would be the consequence, But the first thing I did with my first paycheck was repair her engagement ring that had lost its little diamond. And I really tried. On one of the times that I came back, Erlo called me in and he said to me, so he's heard that I've got a job. I found a job as a receptionist. He's heard that I've got a job, and is this God's will for my life? And I said to him, I don't know where I got the bravery. And I said to him, Uncle Erlo, I didn't consult God on this decision. And he went off at me. So Erlo's the only person who's allowed to get angry at KwaSizabantu. He has a righteous rage. Everybody else has sinful anger. But I got the full brunt of his righteous rage. He told me that I would never be happy. He told me that my future husband was going to sleep around with other women, because really that's all they fixated on. And then the third thing he told me, and I believed him, was that God's curse was now on my life. He placed God's curse on my life. And so I left with God's curse on my life. And I carried that around for a long time. I mean, and now I'm out in the world and I knew nothing. And I literally knew nothing. And so I write in my book about that journey of learning to live in the world, and lots of funny things happened to me. And I mean, I sometimes still, my girlfriends and I, when a new person joins the group, they say, Erika, you've got to tell her about that story or that story or that story, because I just have so many insane stories, a lot of them to do with sex. Can I just say that people shouldn't call a blowjob a blowjob, because there's no blowing involved.
Oh, Erika.
So one of my stories at dinner parties is my first blowjob, when he pushed me down to Little John, and I realized, okay, this must be a blowjob. And I took Little John in my mouth and I went, and I just moved with all my might. So yeah, there were lots of funny situations.
Yeah, well, that's deserved for pushing your head down there in the first place.
Exactly. I hope he's doing better these days. Maybe that taught him a lesson as well. I knew that if I killed myself, I would go straight to hell. So there were times when I was trying to figure out how to get murdered, because maybe if I got murdered, God would have mercy on me. And then slowly but surely, I started realizing that even though I still felt I was going to hell, and my mother told me I was not her daughter until I chose Elo as my spiritual leader. I started seeing the abuse for what it was. And how it happened was that I got into a relationship with a really sweet guy. And when I told him some stories, he would be so horrified at what happened. And he helped me see that what I'd experienced and witnessed was abuse. And so I left in January 1993. And around April, I think March, April of 1996, so 3 years later, I heard that KwaSizabantu was going to open a school in France, a branch of Domino Savite school they were going to open in France, and that the residents of the French village had felt uneasy about this. So I contacted the French people, and I told them that I would be very happy to share my experiences with them because I shared their concern about opening the school. Somehow the Sunday Tribune heard of this and they published a report, and I think it included my name. I don't have that newspaper report anymore and I can't find it online. This was kind of before the internet days, but they reported on this, and I think that's when KwaSizabantu realized that I would be quite prepared to speak out against them, and they kind of tried to threaten me a little bit, but I didn't pay too much attention. Then as I got to know more about the world, more about myself, I realized more and more just how weird their whole indoctrination was. And then one day I was paging through a Cosmopolitan magazine. Now, KwaSizabantu didn't allow any magazines there, but there was this whole thing about Return of the Virgins. So there was this thing that they imported from America about pledging a true love waits. So pledging that you wouldn't have sex before marriage. And so basically KwaSizabantu was using Cosmopolitan as a vehicle to proselytize. And I was so angry at this that I wrote Cosmopolitan a long letter about my experience. And they phoned me a few times to double check that I was happy to put my name on there. And I was like, yes, I want KwaSizabantu to know, And then they published this. And then 2 years later, there was a magazine article competition where you wrote your story and you could win some money. And I decided to write my story and they published it. And that was in February 2000. And it caused a huge uproar in the South African media. The Sunday papers picked up on it. And KwaSizabantu went into overdrive of getting their people to write to the newspapers to say it's all lies, it's all lies, it's all lies. So I wrote about the public beatings in this article. And then KwaSizabantu said to the magazine people that public beatings never took place there. By March, so many people had said what Erika wrote was the truth, because they had also left, that KwaSizabantu changed their tune and said, yes, there were public beatings there, but it was the parents who beat the children, not KwaSizabantu. So they lied. And then I actually got a fair bit of kickback from people who had left the mission in South Africa who were unhappy with me because they said that I was bringing disrepute to God's name. I was doing harm to God's work. They still believed KwaSizabantu was a place that was doing a lot of good. I said, how can God be in a place that does this? There's no God there. I, by this stage, didn't identify as a Christian anymore, but they still did. And so I felt that they judged me, although there were a few that really supported me. And the German ex-KSBers really supported me. But I thought I've done it now. I've shone a light on this place. I'm going to put the past in the past where it belongs, because everyone always says you've got to, let it go. Let it go, Erika, let it go. So I was fucking letting it go. And I carried on with my life for 19 years. And I basically broke off contact with anybody and everybody that was part of KwaSizabantu, except for my brother, who is like my hero and my rock and my everything. Chris. I adore him, and yeah, I wouldn't be here today without him. So then I had kind of a little bit of contact when Facebook started coming up, people making friend requests. And so I'd connected to a few people, but I wasn't associating with anyone from those days. And then in 2019, I got a message that apparently there are some girls who've been accused of being Satanists, and one of my nieces. So what I must say is that back in 1996, my brother-in-law forbade me to have any contact with my nieces because he said it was his God-given duty to protect them from Satan and from evil, and I wasn't allowed to have any contact with them. So my nieces basically grew up without knowing me. The littlest one did still know me because she was a little bit older, but the third one was born after I'd already left. And so I heard that one of my nieces was supposedly one of these people who'd been pointed out to be Satanists. And if KwaSizabantu expelled them, would I be willing to give her a home? And I said, fuck yes, of course. Like, that would be the best thing that's ever happened. And that got me back in touch with a lot of ex-KSB people. And I learned that there were a whole lot who'd been trying to effect change. And they'd gone to the South African Human Rights Commission and had no joy. They had tried to get the police involved because they consider there being serious fraud happening, millions of rands disappearing. No joy. And then someone from the National Prosecuting Authority actually said to them, you need to get the media involved because then the authorities will have to act. Because, like, let's face it, South Africa, we are known for our corruption. As much as it pains me to say so, we are known for our corruption. And when a place is as filthy rich as KwaSizabantu, you can bet your bottom dollar some of that money has made its way into people who shape the policies of the province. And in fact, they can take me to court and I'll repeat this allegation in court. I can't justify it, but I'm waiting for them to take me to court. They keep threatening that they're going to take me to court and they fucking don't. Like, why not? Because they know I can call hundreds of people to testify that what I'm saying is the truth. But anyway, so this person advised us to take it to the media. And because I'm in the media, I've been working in the media industry since 2003. They said, Erika, please, will you help us? And so I approached my one friend and I said, who do you think I should speak to? And he said, well, you should definitely speak to Adrian Basson of News 24. Now, News 24 is South Africa's biggest online news organization. And I was just like, oh, come on, he's not going to give me an audience. Like, how am I going to get an audience with him? So Peter sent him an email. And so February 2020, I had a meeting with Adrian and he believed me. You know, the thing for any survivor, I think the most important thing for someone to know when you're speaking to a survivor of abuse is to acknowledge that you believe them. You don't have to say the words, I believe you, that's great. But even if you just say, I'm so sorry that happened to you, that shows you believe them. Anyway, Adrian believed me. And he actually wrote the foreword to my book. I'm so happy about that. And he launched a 7-month investigation with a whole team of his reporters. And a lot of people came forward. I helped put them in touch with these people who had gotten me involved and who had asked me to get involved. And then lockdown happened. March, like the next month, suddenly the country was in lockdown. So I was creating a podcast and helping them film a documentary and articles during lockdown. So that was quite intense and hectic. But in a way, I also felt safe because I live in a security complex and we weren't allowed to travel interprovincial. So I thought, well, they can't come and kill me. And then before September, KwaSizabantu, News 24 obviously sent all the allegations to KwaSizabantu. They basically just responded to say, these are family issues, it happened long ago, we're not going to comment. And then just before the expose launched, my mother took to the pulpit and denounced me from the pulpit. So they knew it was coming, and they had to get in front of it and basically lie about me. And they put the video on YouTube for everyone to read, to see what my mother said about me, which was horrible. And then in September, Exodus launched. It's a 4-part podcast. I'm so happy my friend Zelimpilo Malinga joined me. And so the podcast interweaves our stories. It's just 4 episodes. It's really well done.
I can recall Daniel speaking of this individual as well.
Yes, Zelimpilo. She's amazing. And she was kicked out of school at the age of 15 because she accepted a bar of chocolate from a man. And she was given a severe beating, and she was 15 years old, and she walked out of there with only the clothes on her back. And yeah, that's what they do. This lot of godly people. So that, of course, created a huge firestorm in South Africa, because everybody knew Akwele. And Adrian wrote an editorial that said, do you want to stop a cult? Well, stop drinking Akwele water. So, of course, when you hit them where the money is, then they're going to start fighting back. And they started fighting back really dirty. They've vilified me. Unfortunately, the retailers who pulled Akwele off the shelves, Akwele is back on the shelves, but there is an official inquiry that was launched, but 16 months later, they still haven't given their report. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but at least it's out there now. And a lot of people have found healing because they've been able to speak about these things for the first time. Because I think we all think that we're walking wounded and we're alone. And I think that this just made a lot of people realize that no, we're not alone. But they definitely weaponized my family against me big time. But yeah.
Such an incredible journey. And the thing that I find most inspiring about all of that is that your actual work around KSB and the whistleblowing that you have done and the activism work that you have done has actually been the catalyst to help people to leave KSB. And that is incredible. The amount of validation that you have given other survivors of this movement, other people who have experienced the same systemic beatings that you endured, the same parental neglect, the same spiritual abuse, the same grooming, the same sexual assaults, like you have given so much back to those people who probably had those experiences and thought, I can never tell anybody about this because I'll never be believed. This has never happened to anybody else. Otherwise, surely I would have heard about it. You have just, with your book, there was so many times where, and it gives me goosebumps now, there was so many times where I was like, I have chills just trying to comprehend the level of validation and just power that you must have given back to these victims and individuals that went through the same experiences that you did. I mean, I can't even imagine how that feels for you. I know there's a lot of times in the book that you talk about there being a lot of things that you're not proud of, things that you're not happy about, times you didn't speak up for people, times that you may have given lashes, you know, as KSB expected people to. Again, as we said before, it's not as black and white as, you know, stopping things or speaking out or not confessing sins or not making sins up just to get people off your back. But I can't believe the journey that you've been on in the last 20 years and the amount of people that you must have helped with your work. And all of that has led to you writing this book where everybody can read about it.
God.
You're like, I said in the email, you're like a powerhouse. You just can't be stopped. You just don't, like, I mean, I don't swear much on this show, but you just don't give a fuck. You just won't stop and you can't be silenced. And I just think it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah. And you know what? I'm quite vocal on Twitter, and I take them on Twitter, and they read every word I put out there, because So I got this really awful death threat. I've had horrible messages from people. Look, by far, like 98% of people that I've heard from, strangers, complete strangers, right across the globe. I mean, I've become friends with people in the US who have read my book and who just reached out to me. They never knew of KwaSizabantu, but my book touched them. So 98% of the messages I've had from people have been positive, but 2% have been absolutely awful. And some of them have been very specific about my family. So I know they come from someone at KwaSizabantu, but I got the most awful death threat a few months ago. And I put it on Twitter because I'm just like, fuck you, you fucking fuck. Sorry, that's like my favorite saying. Fuck you, you fucking fuck. You are not going to silence me. And I put the death threat out on Twitter and I said, I got this death threat. And it's someone who described how he was going to slice my ankles and my wrists and my arms. He was going to cut off my hands and then cut my stomach open and take out my intestines. And he was going to take such pleasure in this. The police investigated and they've told me now that they haven't been able to find out who it is. But I mean, News 24 has been able to find out more about who sent this than the police. So I find that quite interesting. But anyway, so KwaSizabantu put on their website, it has come to our attention that a certain ex-member of KwaSizabantu has apparently received death threats. We believe the appropriate authorities are investigating it, and they basically just wanted to say that they didn't send this death threat, but they freaking don't name me or anything. They are so scared that their congregants are going to find out about my book and read my book. So they preach about the filth that people write. I know they're preaching about me, but they won't say Erika Bornman, because they don't want people to Google me because there's internet now these days. So then a lot of people have engaged with me on Twitter. And do you know what KwaSizabantu has done? They've actually found these people's phone numbers and phoned them and said, don't believe everything Erika says, come to KwaSizabantu and come and see for yourself. You can meet her mother and her sister and speak to them.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yes. And so then I put on Twitter, if you engage with me, just beware, you might get a phone call from KwaSizabantu themselves. And they don't, they're so clueless. They have never been held accountable, so they're floundering, although they have appointed a very powerful PR person who's obviously quite happy to take their money. And I'm not naming her, but she knows who she is. She's obviously very happy to take their money to try and polish their image, and they're putting a lot of money into sponsoring sports events because South African sport needs sponsorship. So they're filling that need, but they are absolutely using their millions to whitewash their reputation. And I'm sure they are, but they haven't taken me to court yet. They haven't taken me to court. And I have called them abusers. I've called them harboring pedophiles. I've called them liars. I've called them cowards. I've called them cowardly abusers. I don't mince my words on Twitter. I think people probably mute me because they must get sick of me saying, hey, KwaSizabantu, I hear you doing this now. And like, what about this? And, but yeah, I literally don't give a fuck. But writing the book was hard. I cried every day for the 5 months that it took me to write it. It was hard, and I said to my therapist, the next person who says to me, this must be so cathartic for you, because I didn't tell a lot of people that I was writing the book because I didn't want KwaSizabantu to find out. And I have to say that when I knew the book was at the printers, I had a sigh of relief because they can do something to me now and they can silence me now, but my book is there and it's always going to be there. They're never going to be able to silence me completely now that my book is out there. But I said to my therapist, the next person who tells me that it must be so cathartic and so healing to write this, I'm going to actually throttle them, because it felt like absolute torture. But of course it was cathartic and healing. And do you know what happened for me is I developed so much empathy for me as a young girl, for me as a young woman, for me as me now. And after the week the book was coming out, I turned 50. So what a great birthday present. And the morning before I turned 50, I watched the sunrise and I just started crying. I was so overwhelmed because for the first time in my life, I like who I am. I like myself. And I was so overwhelmed. I thought, is this what other people feel? Is this people who maybe had more validation as a child, how they feel? And so now I feel very unshakable. Like they can do whatever they want. They're not going to shake me. Of course, I hear things and things happen and I hear what my sister says or what, and of course it hurts and I still get emotional and I still feel pain, but I am unshakable now that I like myself. Yeah. Yeah.
Just incredible and so inspiring. And I just feel like the position that women are put in KSB compared to the position that you are sitting in now is just like it's just absolutely incredible. I mean, something that we haven't even touched on, I don't even know if we need to, because we covered it a lot in Daniel's episode, and it's a very difficult piece of subject matter. It that doesn't take away the importance of it, but the virginity testing that takes place in KSB is particularly problematic. If anybody wants to hear about it and hasn't heard about it, you can obviously pick up Erika Bornman's book, Mission of Malice, My Exodus from KwaSizabantu. But you can also go back to a previous episode where I spoke to Daniel and he just kind of explained what the virginity testing looks like. And I was very thankful for Daniel's kind of clinical approach to that conversation, because I feel like that's something you have to detach yourself from when you talk about it. Otherwise, it's just, I just don't want to live in a world where that even exists. And of course,
actually,
it's not as simple as that.
Pilo talks about it in the podcast we did for News 24. It's called Exodus, the podcast that News 24 produced. And Pilo actually talks about what that was like. But yes, they tested the Black girls after they came home back to the boarding school after every holiday. Girls as young as 5. They checked whether their hymens were still. They basically sexually assaulted every Black girl child there 4 times a year, and they should be held accountable. And once again, they first denied that it happened, and then they said, "Oh, but it was the parents who insisted," and that's bullshit. It was not the parents; it was mission policy.
I just don't even understand how that's excusable, even if parents were demanding it. What would you just commit genocide and say, well, the parents asked for it, and so, we went ahead and just kind of did what they asked us to? That's just absolute, it's just madness. So I'm going to put a link to that News 24 podcast Exodus in the episode description for anyone that wants to go and find that, along with everywhere that we can find Erika's work. So my last 2 questions to you before we finish today. Oh, actually, KwaSizabantu, that's the place where people are helped. Is that?
Yes. Kwa is a kind of place, Siza is help, and Bantu is people. So the place where people are helped. Yeah.
Right. So if anybody would like to get in touch and confirm whether they do believe in that ethos, that would be great. I've actually written here in my notes the place where people are held.
Yes.
Instead of helped, because that feels much more in line with your personal experiences.
Yeah.
So before we finish, what advice would you have for other members who are going through their own journeys of deconstruction, who are looking to add to the 70 plus testimonies that you have collected to take, into your activism work? So, yes, take us to court already.
Yes.
for anybody that is leaving their own demand, a high demand religious group that isn't KSB, what advice would you give to people going through all of these experiences?
This is the wonderful thing about the internet, is that we're not alone anymore. When I left, I felt very alone. There weren't a lot of resources. And I just started reading a lot of books. And one of the first books that really made a very, very deep impression on me was Under the Banner of Heaven. But anyway, it's about a Mormon, extreme Mormon group that then there was murder and everything. But I recognized so many things. I mean, that book is filled with my notes and margins because I just recognized so many things. But so I would say that there are so many incredible books to read now. And the wonderful thing is that many of them are on Audible. My book's also on Audible. But then I discovered igotout.org. And this is a group of people who have actually put together resources and are putting other people's stories on there. That is just so incredibly helpful. And I would lean on other people, and if you're in a group and you're concerned that they are maybe a high control group or a cult and you're not sure, rather don't ask them because they'll say no. Reach out to someone that you trust who's outside of the group and just start doing your own research. That's become such a bad thing to say because it's all the people who are anti-vaccine who say you should do your own research. But with this, really do your own research. And Daniel has actually written 4 essays about how KwaSizabantu's use of fear, how it impacts the children there. And I think that would be true for a lot of these groups. I think, yes, KwaSizabantu has its own quirks, but really they are nothing special. They think they're so special, but they are just really exactly the same as all these other high control evangelical cults. They just put their own little African twist on it. But I would recommend there are incredible resources. There's also the internet, the ICSA. Oh goodness, now I don't have it written in front of me, but the International
Cultic Studies Association.
Yes, thank you. There's a website with a lot of resources as well. Dr. Yanya Lali, her books actually, Stephen Hassan. I mean, there are so many resources. Just like listen, and the really interesting thing for me is that the memoirs that really resonated with me as a similar experience to mine are the ones from the Latter-day Evangelical. Oh goodness, I forget all these words now. But those, like the Witness War Read, just there's so many amazing books that are read, and if you're not a big reader, listen, and to podcasts like yours, because every podcast of yours that I've listened to, I learn something new. There's something that resonates. I have a little light bulb moment. It's just so amazing how much, and that's the power of storytelling. The power of telling our stories is that we learn from each other, and we learn that we're not alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Some incredible podcasts. There really are some amazing conversations taking place, and YouTube channels as well, across various different spaces within the cult, deconstruction, community and awareness, and all of those things. But this podcast is actually listed on the ICSA website, so there are really some amazing resources on there, and you speak a lot in your book about KSB Alert, and Daniel mentioned that website as well, and Daniel's essays are actually available through KSB Alert, so I will also add the link to that website in the episode description for anybody that wants to find those things. But I think that's great. Just read. I mean, your audiobook on Audible, is that read by you?
No, I wanted to read it, but my publisher decided that they would rather get a professional reader. And in a way, I'm actually glad because I was reading the book out loud to my boyfriend. And when it got to the chapters about my dad, I wasn't able to really, I mean, just thinking about it now, I get emotional. So in a way, I think it's like, I love listening to books that are read by the authors, but yeah, maybe one day. Yeah.
And for anybody that isn't sure, where can we find all of your work, your social media handles? Where are all the places people can go and find Mission of Malice?
So you can find me on Twitter, EB40. You can find me on Instagram. I don't know, could you put those in the show notes?
Yeah. I absolutely can, yeah.
And then Mission of Malice, if you're in South Africa, please buy it from an independent bookstore. If you're overseas at the moment, I would love to get a publisher in the UK and in the US, but at the moment it's available through Barnes & Noble in the US, but also Amazon. It's on Kindle and it's on Audible. Yeah.
Amazing. And I am incredibly excited to see where you will be in the next few years with all of the work that you are doing around uncovering or just putting a spotlight onto all of the horrific things that are happening in and around KSB. I think it's so incredibly important that such a strong voice is at the forefront of all of this, and it just bolsters the rest of the survivor community hugely. It must empower so many other people to come forward. I mean, like I said, you've collected over 70 testimonies of other people who have been through these experiences, and you have all of that information collated and ready to go. And I just feel like, you know, some people feel like they get a calling to complete missionary work, and I feel like your calling is to just bring everything down onto KSB. And I really can't wait to see where you will be in the next few years with all of this work. Thank you so much for everything that you do for all of these people. Thank you for taking the time and the agony to pen your memoir and allow it to be out there for people to use as a resource, as a tool to, you know, hopefully recognize signs and symptoms of high demand religious groups that are harboring predators and covering up historical abuse and actually encouraging these environments to exist. So just thank you for all of your work, Erika. Thank you for sending me a copy of your book and allowing me to be a small part of this journey, for coming here to sit with me today. I have your copy of Betsy's book, which I will be sending over to you, and a pack of Cult Vault stickers and some swag as well. So that's going to be on its way to you soon. I just really hope that you continue on the trajectory that you're on. But if you decide to take a step back and have some rest, I think you really do deserve that more than a lot of people I know as well. So just thank you so much,
Casey, and thank you so much for you know, reading my book and being so prepared for like speaking to me about my story and for the work you do, because I love listening to your podcast. And I'm just so sorry that I'm not going to be in the UK for CrimeCon, but I'm going to be rooting for you, and I just hope it's amazing.
It's actually, there's a couple of people I've spoken to on the show that are making their way over to the UK this year. So I'm really excited to actually connect with guests that I've had on the show. So if you ever do make your way over to this side of the world, I would just love to connect. So keep in touch, and I will definitely be watching your progression across social media. And I'm really excited to see where you'll be. So thank you so much, Erika, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
You're a star.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of The Cult Vault.